Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Fly podcast. I'm joined again by Swithun, Dobson, and Keith Preston. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe and hit the notification bell. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter, Facebook, and Telegram. And you can support me on Locals as well as buy me a coffee and subscribe star. This is episode 74 of the Lyceum Roundtable. Who or what is the ruling class? Now, actually, Keith, this is something that you have already written about quite a lot, and you take a position which is not what you would call classic libertarian or classic socialist, and say that it's a position that's more indebted to managerialism. So why don't you explain who you think the ruling class is? Okay, hold on. You're muted, Keith. Let's see if we can figure this out. There we go.
All right. Yeah. So when different people talk about who the ruling class is, there are several prevailing theories. The term, I think, was popularized initially by Marxists, and they consider, of course, the ruling class to be those who control the means of production, which in their time would have been the factories and workshops and plantations and things like that. And I guess the modern version of that would be the major industries and major technological companies and financial companies and things like that. That's one version of the ruling class. There's also the libertarian version, as you mentioned, and they tend to view the ruling class in terms of beneficiaries of state intervention versus non-beneficiaries of state intervention. And then you also have various other theories of the ruling class. A few years ago, there was a popular article in conservative circles by a guy named Angelo Codavia. And Angelo Codavia more or less outlined a theory of the ruling class that claimed the cultural elite or the ruling class. And by that, he meant the media and elite universities and cultural institutions of that type. Now, I think all of these conventional theories are problematic because what I've noticed most of them do is that they simply criticize the aspects of the elite or the systems of power, the distribution of power in society that they don't like. For example, to someone who's a conservative, they tend to not like the media very much, or they tend to not like the elite universities very much, or they tend to not like the entertainment industry very much because most of that stuff is dominated by liberals. And of course, the Marxists, one thing you have to remember about them is that Marx was writing at a time before many of the kinds of institutions we have today were actually established. He lived in a time when technology and economic life are somewhat simpler than they are now. And then the libertarian view, the view that, well, it's simply about who benefits from state intervention in the economy. I think a problem with that is that I think one thing that's interesting about Kevin Carson's work in this area is that I think it often underestimates the kind of relationship the state has with other institutions and other social forces. So the approach that I would take is something like this. I would compare the ruling class to the ruling classes of the Middle Ages. And if we look at the Middle Ages in a medieval society, most historians will say, well, who was the ruling class of the Middle Ages? It was the royal dynasties, the royal families, the hereditary monarchs, and their networks of associates. It was the traditional titled aristocracy that tended to control lots of agricultural production through heredity, and then their family connections and that kind of thing. There was also the established church and the church hierarchy, the Pope, and all of these other things. And then you also had different levels of this. I mean, you might have a lower level feudal lord and a higher level feudal lord and those kinds of things. There were lots of different systems of ranking within these kinds of societies. And I think something similar exists today in the sense that we have the political state, the government. Now, one thing that's different about modern governments as opposed to older governments is that modern governments tend to have a more impersonal identity. The state is a corporative enterprise in the sense that It's not identified with any one person or his family or anything like that. It's identified with this institution. For instance, when we think of the United States government, we don't just think of the Biden family or the Trump family or the Bush family or the Clinton family. We think of those as being players within the state, but not the state itself. Older states were more like what you would find in North Korea today, where you have a family that is more or less personifies the state. So that's one issue. But the state, the political state, I think is comparable in some ways to the older royal dynasties. And then you have the corporate elite, and then the elite across the economic institutions generally. That's the large industries, financial institutions, banks, the tech companies now, a lot of these kinds of things. They're somewhat comparable to the aristocracy in the sense that they largely, not entirely, but largely inherit their position, and they control large sectors of the economy, and they do so in collusion with the state, the political government. And then in the Middle Ages, you had the church, and the role of the church was as the disseminator and arbiter of social values. The idea that you could have society without the influence of the church would have been unthinkable in the Middle Ages. Nowadays, however, organized religion, while it's obviously still exists, it's somewhat secondary in influence or tertiary in influence to other types of cultural institutions that shape the society in terms of values and social norms. And I would say today, the educational system, the mass media, the universities, the entertainment industry, advertising and marketing in some of those kinds of fields, journalism, law, the ideas industries general, that is the industries that deal in ideas and ways of thinking, those fields, I would say today, are the modern church in the sense of being the people and groups that establish the overall social norms. Religion still plays a role too, but I think it's secondary to some of these other things. And then there's different layers to this. There's different sectors to this, and there's different layers. I think one problem I have with a lot of conspiracy theorists is that they think that the ruling class is some unified monolith, and they're not. I think a better analogy would be something comparable to the five families of New York. Like if you look at how the mafia, the traditional Italian mafia, is structured, you've got the individual crime families. They've got their system of ranking within each of the crime families. Then they have their collective governing body, which is the commission. It's called the commission. But then there are also rivals within among themselves as well. I mean, they carry out hits against each other and that kind of thing. And then they also have all of these lesser gangs and organized crime groups that they're aligned with that aren't necessarily part of the big players. And the ruling class is structured in the same way. The ruling class is not horizontal within itself. The ruling class is hierarchical within itself. And the ruling class is not a unified monolith engaged in some kind of conspiracy. The ruling class is a scattered collection of power interests that have nothing in common with each other than maintaining their collective status. Other than that, they have no common interest and may be enemies with each other. And then there's different levels of the ruling class in other ways. For example, at the local level in the United States, and when it comes to local governments, you have a lot of local real estate interests, business interests, sometimes cultural or institutional interests, who are able to dominate local politics, the local economy, and the local culture. In the city that I live in, for example, there's long been a number of big corporations and a number of cultural institutions and a number of civic and real estate and business organizations that pretty much dominate the city government. In the town that I grew up in years ago, there was a large religious organization that pretty much dominated the local culture to a large degree and much of the local economy. So the ruling class is scattered, both horizontally and vertically. you can find all sorts of oligarchs within all kinds of different sectors of the economy, of the cultural institutions, and within the political institutions. And I think that's the best way to understand what the ruling class is. And this fits with basically what's called elite theory. And there are left and right wing versions of elite theory. Left wing elite theory tends to be similar to Marxism in the sense that it's all about trying to identify who's calling the shots and who's exploiting whom and who's plotting to carry out a war or something like that. Like if you get into thinkers like C. Wright Mills and William Domhoff, that's a good example of left-wing elite theory. You also have right-wing elite theory, and that's thinkers like the Italian elite theorists like Pareto and Mosca and Michaels. They tend to be more interested in how systems actually work just in a mechanical sense. And then out of their ideas came James Burnham's idea of the managerial revolution and this kind of thing. And that fits with what I was talking about earlier about the idea that the state or the ruling class is to a large degree this impersonal corporative entity that has its own institutional interest apart from that of the individuals that are involved. So the ruling class tends to be far more complex than what many people recognize, particularly conspiracy theorists who think it's just a handful of people sitting around in a room, like the Wizard of Oz character, with the man behind the curtain pulling levers or something like that. That's a grossly oversimplistic view of what the ruling class is. But I think also the Marxist, libertarian views, some conservative views on what the ruling class is are also seriously flawed. For instance, the libertarians have the idea that the state is the root of all evil. If we just got rid of the state, everything would be great. But where did the state come from? I mean, the state emerged from a wider society, from a collection of human beings. It didn't just pop out of the sky. And then you also have the Marxist view, well, if only we put the means of production in the hands of the right people, then then the ruling class will be eliminated. But we know from historical experience that's not the case. And then I think far more common in a society like the ones we live in today, you have different political factions claiming they're enemies of the ruling class. Like I mentioned, Angelo Codavilla earlier, and there are liberal and left examples of that. Like to hear some liberals and left tell the story, you would think that the ruling class just amounted to Donald Trump and the fossil fuel industry and the Republican Party and Fox News, and that's the full spectrum. The full spectrum of the ruling class. No, the ruling class is not a monolith. It's not a conspiracy. It's something that's highly sophisticated and scattered both vertically and horizontally.
Okay, Swithun, what is the ruling class?
Well, I think before we have to answer the question who are the ruling class, I think really the question is sort of what is rule, and really rule seems to be a subset of power, and this I think it came across well in Keith's opening statement that there is multifarious forms of power, and these are held by different peoples in different places in different groups, and so they can effectively influence society in their own interest. Now, you could then say, well, what is power? Well, I would say that power is basically the means to achieve your own goals. It's just that there is lots of different ways of doing that. You can have sort of like economic power. That is, if you have basically a lot of money, you can get a lot of what you want. If you have superior weaponry and violent power, then you can get things via force. You can convince people that what they should do is what you tell them to do, because what you're telling them to do is right. Is the moral thing to do. And that's what you could call like persuasive power. And that may be like the media. Although with the media as well, in how that tends to work, the persuasion doesn't tend to take place in a form of rational argumentation. It's more of, well, we just show you images and stories and show who is the good guy, who is the bad guy, and then people imbibe what is the right moral thing to do by doing that. Those seem to be some of the major forms of power, at least in sort of like a social sense. So I think that's kind of fundamental really to this. But then the question is, well, who is the ruling class? And I think really what we have to think here is, well, what does it mean to rule? And also at this point, whether or not you could have a society without a ruling class. It seems to me that the fundamental decision making that needs to take place within the community is essentially what is the law, what is um, right, well, what is legally actionable and what's not. If Because in the case of non-contractual relations, there needs to be some sort of common standard to be maintained. So, for instance, you couldn't have in the same sort of small community. Now, obviously, you could have different communities, different ones. But a good example would be abortion. You couldn't both have abortion to be legal and illegal at the same time, because how would any sort of socially sanctioned action be able to take place on somebody? Because, well, if he thinks, well, it's healthcare, and other one thinks it's murder, then if the purpose of law, which I think in part is to be able to make functioning societies work and have sort of cooperation, then there needs to be some sort of mechanism by which not only is the law decided, but a means of enforcing it. And I think this is where sort of ultimately, in a sense, a ruling class as such appears in its most narrow sense, I must add at this point. And also to recognize as well, the reason ruling classes exist is because some people are more competent than others. Um, there are always man is inherently unequal, and for this reason, some people will rise to the top, some will be ruled, and some will be the rulers. Not everybody could be a chief. There is always going to be Indians. And this is just an obvious fact of nature. Now, this is one of the, I think, utopian ideas of some of the left is, oh, everyone's going to be equal. It's like, well, they aren't. They're simply not. If you've taught different people, you know that is not true. Some people are stupid and some people aren't. People who are clever will probably rule over those who are stupid. So putting all that together, I think you're always going to have a society or a political community. Political community here be defined as maybe effective. You could probably say like one where effective criminal law is the same. There's always going to be a body of people who decide what that needs to be, and those people are the rulers in a sense. And I would put the locus of the ruling class in that sort of legal sense, but then of course, how the law is then determined is then influenced by multifarious different factors. And it's going to depend on context as to what's the most important. I mean, so you could say, well, the violent power is the most important, the war machine. But then the question is, well, how did you afford to produce the war machine? How did you get the resources to make all the weaponry? And it's like, oh, well, maybe economic power, but then it's going to depend on context as to what's kind of the most important form of power. But onto the ruling class today, of what I would say it generally is, I would take a view that it's generally from functions of the state, because the state today is sort of the lawmaking power body. But just to recognize that the extent to which state influence extends is so great that it isn't as obvious to say, oh, well, there's net tax receivers and net taxpayers. The net tax receivers could well receive far greater income than they otherwise would do because of government intervention, licensing requirements, etc. So even though I wouldn't expect, for instance, the outcomes of, say, Kevin Carson to take place, his analysis as to how different, for instance, society and the economy, etc., is relative to what would be a genuine free market in a Rothbardian sense. It's so great, and it simply isn't the case that, well, the corporations are good and the state is bad. Well, the corporations exist with a symbiotic relationship with the state. So as to who is the ruling class, in a sense, I can't name people. Well, obviously the people are members of a ruling, at least as to who is on top. I mean, as Keith said, it's sort of, there's lots of different levels to it, and there's lots of different people. But I think that would be the way I go about looking at the ruling class.
All right. So for me, I'm going to sort of jump off. Not of course that I wholly disagree with Keith or that I wholly disagree with you, Swithin, but you made a point, Swithin, where you said that power, there's different kinds of power, right? There's economic power, there's social power, there's military state power. The kind of power that I'm going to focus on is technological power. And so we can say that in the current system of the United States, all these forms of power coexist in some sort of hierarchical relationship. But the question is, who really is the most fundamental? The most fundamental in the sense means in this context that the one that depends the least upon all the others and which the others depend on more. So, this will change over time, obviously. So, in a sort of like commercial society, like, ancient Carthage or, the American United States, it would seem that the financial elements were more decisive for longer. But that can change, right? You can look at, say, in Russia, with the Bolshevik Revolution, it went from an aristocracy to a party. But I think for many reasons, we can make the case that technology is, and so technology is the most fundamental power, and then those that create the technology, manage the use of the technology, and direct future R&D development of technology are what I would call the elites or the controlling class. And the reason I say this is, one, with the works of, say, obviously everybody knows of Brave New World by Aldous Huxley, where there's a scientific dictatorship that rules the world in a dystopian fashion. He's, ruling through propaganda, right? You can, as Huxley said in his interview with Mike Wallace, you can do anything with a bayonet, but sit on it. And so their goal was stability rather than, imperial conquest, because they already ruled the world. So in that case, they used that. But we also have works of Bertrand Russell, where he writes The Scientific Outlook and the Impact of Science on Society. We have H.G. Wells, The Omen Conspiracy and the New World Order, all of which of these British intelligentsia are writing about this ideal society of technological progress, of a technological society. And his History of World War II, J.F.C. Fuller points out that ultimately the war was won by technological innovation on the part of the Allies, specifically the United States. And he said that, what this shows us is that the real arbiters of society are the technicians, the not just the inventors who come up with the technology, but the technicians that produce and propagate and maintain them. He likens them to the new priesthood. Keith, you've also mentioned before modern medicine, which is a nice subset of this, where you have, was it Thomas Zaz, you like to point out? He talks about how it serves as a new religion, this sort of like health culture based on modern medicine. And so how in what sense is it most fundamental? Well, it's most fundamental in the sense that that's the lens, that's the filter through which everything goes. Because, why in one sense have we completely uprooted all of our previous ways of doing things? Well, because we were told there were more efficient technological ways to do it, from farming to childcare to education to whatever. And they all got uprooted from these, from these organic relationships, and then put through this filter of improved efficiency. And so, for example, in Jacques Ellul's On Technique, he talks about how ultimately efficiency in technology is more fundamental. He wrote this in the 50s than the disagreements over economic resource distribution between the Soviet Union and the United States. And he said that ultimately, because it's ultimately more efficient if the entire world were run by a single technique, that would push for global government or a global merger of technique, which would, could conceivably eventually evolve into government. And that's certainly an argument that's not identical, but very similar to what you find with Bertrand Russell and H.G. Wells and all the other stuff. It's also interesting that it explains the New World Order theory in a way that avoids on what you might call unnecessary conspiratorialism, because you can say there's this process at work that is seeking to merge all of these sources together. And so, and I've seen this in my own life, right? Every time we've had, like, on the right or the left, some sort of social issue that they have, that they don't like where technology's going, right? The left might not like what it does to the environment. The right might not like what it does to social institutions. They can't stop it. They always lose. There was, what, in 2020, I think there was the documentary by, I can't remember his name. It was called Planet of the Humans. Let's see, Planet of the Humans, where the modern environmental movement was
Michael Moore.
thank you, completely subverted by all these institutions. So he calls them the capitalist class and elites, but that's okay, fair enough. But what's motivating them to do that? What's this underlying process? Well, modern technological development. Even when they try to sell the Great Reset, right? They're going, oh, we're gonna have all this modern technology in the cities, and so that always wins, right? Because power is whenever there's a social or political dispute, the more powerful win that dispute, and the victories have all been going in one direction, facilitating more technological development. And anytime someone on the right or the left wants to hold that back because they want to hold something that's more tangible and real, they lose. And so I think that's ultimately what's impinging. So let's rephrase it. Let's look at, say, the automobile and the computer today, right? They exert, as Ted Kaczynski pointed out, this kinds of technology exerts control over us that, one, we didn't consent to, and is more totalizing than any tyrant of any period of history before. So to such a point that we have, I guess, what we could call a kind of technical realism, where we can't even envision a world without the technology itself. And so I think that's where the left falls short in many cases, though there is an anti-technology left component. And that is why I think that the ruling class or the ruling elites are fundamentally those that are tied up in technique. So that would be at least three things: the people that invent the technology, the people that maintain the technology, and then the people that direct the R&D research for the new technology. Keith Preston.
Yeah, what you were saying about the role of technology is interesting, because that's more or less the same as the Marxist view. The Marxist view, of course, is that the society is shaped by the rise and fall of different modes of production. And for instance, they'll say that the earliest humans were hunter-gatherers, and then pastoralists and horticulturalists, and then agriculturalists, and then more sophisticated agriculturalists, and then we had the market revolution and different forms of capitalism, culminating in Marx's time in the Industrial Revolution. So you go through these different, according to the Marxists, you go through these different stages in the evolution of the mode of production, and then what usually marks a transition from one mode of production to another is technological or economic innovation. For instance, the way you could apply this to our world is that in the last few decades, we've had this thing called the digital revolution. And the microchip has really been the equivalent of the modern equivalent of the steam engine or the plow, in the sense that it's totally revolutionized so many different aspects of society and economic life and things like that. And then you can also see the way that shapes social factors. Like the Marxists believe that social relationships are merely an outgrowth of material conditions and material relationships. And they'll say, for example, that the dominant ideology in the state is going to be the ideology that upholds the interest of the people who control the means of production at a particular time. And there's certainly some truth to that, because if you look at the impact, for example, that technology has had on economic evolution and therefore social evolution, what you see is that, one big thing is in the post-war era, you started to see more and more women entering the workforce and no longer working in the home. And one thing that drove that was you had more and more sophisticated technology, and companies needed more workers and more skilled workers. And as a result, they needed to find more and more sources of labor. That's one reason why the workplace was able to absorb more and more women into the workforce, and then immigrants and all of that. That's one reason, for example, why we now have so many South Asian people living in the West, is because a lot of that was driven by the tech industry, bringing people from other parts of the world who had those particular skills. So the technological factor, I think, is extremely important. There are others as well. Well, you mentioned Bertrand Russell. There was a book Bertrand Russell wrote back in the 30s called On Power, where he talks about different types of power and that different groups and institutions can exercise. And of course, one of them is what he calls naked power, or naked power is just basically the ability to exercise raw force. Meaning, if you don't do what we want, we're going to kill you, or we're going to put you in jail, or we're going to drop a bomb on you, or something like that. And that's, of course, the just raw state and military power. And then there's also economic power, and that's the ability to control people's actions through economics. When your boss says, "I'm going to fire you if you don't do what I want you to do," all right, that's economic power. There's also the power of public opinion, and parallel to that is cultural power. And then parallel to that is, excuse me, parallel to that is the dominance of particular groups in society. And of course, the left will point out, well, you have the dominance in traditional Western societies of white males or straight people or Christians or Catholics or whomever. And then, of course, there's also a reverse of that. There's also the fact that former outgroups can become in-groups and also become powerful. For example, in the ancient world, we saw that the church was once an outgroup, and then it took over the Roman state and became the in-group. We saw that in the Reformation when Protestants became the dominant group, and then we see that in the American Revolution, the French Revolution, when what was formerly the middle class becomes the dominant group, and then in the communist revolutions, you see the communist parties are becoming the dominant group. So these kinds of things you have a lot of dynamics of their own. And the technology is interesting, though. I do think that a great deal of consideration has to be given to technology when we discuss who the ruling class is, and not just technology, but also ecological power. I think the question of who controls the actual natural resources is important. Who has access to the minerals, who has access to the waterways, who has access to the airspace, all of these kinds of things. Like, I know Peter Zion, one thing he points out is the way the United States became dominant as an international power in the post-war period is through basically controlling international waters and sea lanes. Through that, the Americans were able to create the foundation for global trade networks that the Americans, and by extension the West, dominated. So you have ecological power, you have technological power, you have cultural power, and then you also have political and economic power as well. And all of these things seem to intersect with each other. You have ways in which people from different groups in each of these groups circulate. For instance, it's not uncommon for someone to go from being a high-ranking government official to being a university president, or going from being a member of Congress to holding a seat on the board of directors of a more major corporation or something like that. So there's also a lot of intersection among members of the ruling class. And like I said, there's a lot of different levels of the ruling class. There was one elite theorist, a guy named Floyd Hunter, who years ago wrote about the role of localities in creating ruling classes, because he'll talk about how you have power dynamics that exist in localities, and often that creates a system where those who are most successful at navigating power systems at the local level work their way up through the power structure. Like, there's a guy from my neighborhood like that. There's a guy who lives in my neighborhood who was once the city councilman from my district, and then he became the mayor of the city, and then he became lieutenant governor, and then governor of Virginia, and now he's in the Senate. His name was Tim Kaine, and then he ran for vice president as Hillary's running mate back in 2016. He's epitomizes Floyd Hunter's theory about this. So I think all these different processes intersect with each other, and I think this is why a lot of the conspiratorial worldview about how the Illuminati and all of that are pulling the strings from the top. I think that's why that's a problematic viewpoint, because I think it's far too simplistic.
Okay, Swithun.
When it comes to technology, I am, in a sense, somewhat dubious of the technological explanation. Firstly, when it's invoked, it tends to treat today as a radically different epoch in history. Whereas, as Keith pointed out, I think the Marxist position is a little bit more consistent, which is, well, the mode of production changes over time. And so that's then going to impact the economic situation. And basically, you get technology, in a sense, is a form of economic power. Now, the extent to which, now, the difference, though, I would point out today, though, is the technology we have today has much more power over nature, so that we can transform the environment to how we want it to be in a way that you couldn't do in I don't know, 17, 1800 or something like that. I mean, the amount of control that individual humans can levy on the environment, so like heating, cool, light, or even getting food various different times of year because of like transportation technology and stuff like that, is a lot greater, but I don't necessarily think it's qualitatively different. That said, what the modes of production have done has had, well, since, say, the Industrial Revolution, has changed society. But the reason I think it's changed society isn't because of technology as such. It's just that, in general, people value a particular material standard of living. And if they can get a better material standard of living by moving and getting away from their historic rooted society or whatever, they will tend to do it. And I think that, to a large extent, explains why the technology has been used in the way in which it has. Now, I'm not going to say that the way in which technology is created can't influence the user. I mean, so for instance, phones are designed so that they have notifications turned on, so that it goes off and then you respond to it. That's true. You can always turn them off. There are ways in which you can demonstrate mastery over them. And so my big problem with the technological explanation doesn't say exactly why the technology is used the way in which it is, because there's no reason in principle that people could have gone, well, you know what, we'll just stay in agriculture. We won't go to the towns and the cities. We'll keep the community together and we'll do that. Now, I suppose you could say, well, there's like a collective action problem. That's okay if everybody decides to do it. But if any individual decides in their interest to do so, then that's going to happen. But that depends to what extent. That's going to depend on the values of the people in question. If the values are more material ones, then that's going to make a big difference. But I do think in general the material explanation is a major one. I neglected to say in my opening statement that I should have done. I do think today, related to sort of economic power, one of the classes of people who have not necessarily entire control, but I think it would work if you would treat money as a technology, which I think is fine, is the central banks. They're the only bodies that can create money from nothing legally, and essentially they can buy whatever they want to just by producing it. Which of course then just expropriates people who receive the money last, because people who imagine you have a printing press in your basement, you go and spend all the money, you can buy loads of goods you otherwise couldn't get. And so but the stock of goods hasn't changed, and so the people who receive the money later are going to be able to buy less of it, and they're going to be made worse off. So their nominal income will go up, but their sort of real income goes down. And so that, I think, has massive power. But again, that's all built up to, you know, why does the state have legitimacy, etc.? Why do we use this money? Why don't we use something else? But I would say this, that central banking and the monetary system, because any advanced society will use it, and it's something that can be directly controlled by a particular group for their own interest, in a way that technology as such isn't, because multiple people can use it. But there's much more control in a sense with respect to the monetary system, which then leads to, well, who controls the central banks, etc., etc., who I do think will clearly part of the ruling class. Keith has mentioned the conspiracy theorists a few times. I think I'm some more sympathetic than Keith is to that, because it's clear there are, now, depending on how you understand this, you may or may not agree. There's clearly some highly influential groups who act in their own interest to bring about changes which people, well, act in hiddenly in a way to try and bring about changes that they kind of want. I mean, so an obvious thing in this respect, there's more direct government one, would be the CIA influence on the cultural left in the 1960s to try to prevent lot of the left going onto the side of the Soviet Union on basically economic leftism. This K.P. Maupin talks about this. Kerry Bolton does as well. And there are these massive organizations, lots of the ones who were investigated by the Reese Committee, like the Ford Foundation, etc. Now, to what extent you're going to say this is a conspiracy or whatever, I think is not really the point. The point is you have people who are acting, not necessarily in secret as such, but then certainly not hugely open, and they're just trying to influence particular parts of society to achieve their own goals. And I think these groups of people do exist. So, I mean, for instance, I'm not going to take the position that the lab leak in Wuhan was deliberate, although I think it possibly could be. But it does seem to be the case that a lot of players who are part of who are the ruling class did seem to coalesce. Now, whether this was explicit, where they all got together and said, "Well, let's lock down," I think I think was an interesting. There's a period in which different countries did different things. Then they coalesced on the right inverted commas solution. Now, exactly why that took place and whether that was direct discussion, there was definitely an intent to achieve that goal. I mean, the best example of that, which I think I mentioned here before, is the IMF said any loans were going to be contingent on following World Health Organization advice, which basically meant that Belarus couldn't get any money because Belarus was like, it's a cold, we don't care. And the IMF admitted that this was the case because Belarus had basically said, look, no lockdown, no money, which was essentially true. I do think financial interest, especially in the situation of fiat money, which can be created from nothing. In the case of gold, less easy to manipulate. Still, obviously, you control the gold mines, you can control the money. But given the extent of monetary creation that can take place, it has massive impacts. And I would say in the case of England, London has far more power than it otherwise would because of the City of London, which is basically built around the machinations of the Bank of England and sort of the international financial system. So I think central banking needs to be definitely taken into account.
I would agree that, again, that the banking and other things need to be taken into account. But before I give this to Keith, I do have a couple of questions for you, Swithun. First is, Keith already mentioned the idea that with especially in the post-war era, modern technology allowed women to go into the workforce. And your claim was that, well, for people who invoke technology, they assume that the present is radically different than the past. But I mean, isn't that just self-evidently so with the complete inversion of social norms due to the result of people entering into the workforce that otherwise would have been excluded for prior reasons in the past?
It's certainly the case that technology and less manual labor allows women to function better in the economy outside the home. That is generally true, although there's no necessary reason why they couldn't have used those things within the home. My point was more that that when it came to the development of, say, the steam engine or whatever, there's no necessary reason that causes people to go out into the towns and leave leave the field. Now, of course, there was the Enclosures Act, which helped, obviously, in the case of the English situation. But I'm saying is that the women don't have to go. They don't have to choose to go. Now, the question is, well, what do we mean by choose? Is it voluntary? That's a rabbit hole. What constitutes voluntary? But I'm saying even if the technology is there, why is it used in that way? Why not go, well, okay, we've got this additional resources and means of production that we could do things differently than we did before. Why not use it in a local way? Why not essentially be employed by a husband in a family business? I mean, whilst it allows it to take place, it doesn't explain why it would take place. I mean, it's a necessary condition, yes, but it's not a sufficient one.
Okay, then this leads into the second question then. Obviously in the United States, the Amish, until quite recently, more or less, were able to do this, to hold this sort of community separated from itself. But you see, even if we just look at the increasing material condition, to use the terminology we have today, the increasing, improving material conditions of technology, there will be a point at which you will have to merge, because everybody around you won't be able, they'll lose the ability to even interface with you. So for example, right, imagine you just have this small little community, you want to remain isolated, and you have the farrier industry where you like shoe horses. Well, if everybody switches to automobiles, you're out of a job, and there's really not much you can do about it, because if you're only working for a small community, I mean, how many farriers do you need? In the past, that would have been for the whole country. Now it's just like, well, it's gone, over, right? And then furthermore, if you have many people did fight this. It wasn't like people just said, okay, we're just going to go to the cities. I mean, the last 500 years had just been, industrialization begins around the late 18th century. So for the last 250 years, we've had massive military struggles against indigenous populations by European colonial powers who didn't want to have that way of life imposed on them. And we've had very violent labor disputes with Luddites in England in the 18th century. Even before that, peasant revolts against what was going on with the monarchy, and then violent labor disputes in America. I mean, people for centuries fought against this. They just were defeated by the force of the state.
Well, yeah, they were defeated by the forces of the state. Yes, I mean,
which was using technology. They had guns.
Yeah. But again, that they have the technology. But the question is, why did they use it in the way in which they use it?
Oh, because yeah. So that's the key. Yeah. Well, in that case,
that's all my point is. I mean, clearly, if everybody uses a car, and nobody uses a horse, then clearly you're not going to be able to have a job doing that. I mean, well, yes, clearly, but that's always historically been the case. I mean, various forms of transport change. You require a different. You're going to require a different economic occupation to satisfy that.
Well, that's just efficiency. What drives all of this is efficiency.
No. But the reason why the efficiency misses the point. The point why people do it that way, because they think it is in their own interest to do so. Now, even if it's in the situation, and because they want to have a higher material standard of living, because clearly the guy who used to be a farrier could go, well, actually, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to engage in any form of specialization at all. I'm just going to become genuinely self-sufficient. Or what we will do is we will reduce the amount to the bare minimum possible to get some resources that we otherwise couldn't get if we weren't specialized.
I would just argue the historical record is fairly clear. Most people were willing to die to preserve a lower material standard of condition. Almost all of this was the result of coercion.
Hang on. What do you mean by coercion?
Well, one, as I mentioned, was the coercion of the state, but also the coercion of, if everybody else around you decides that they don't that they're going to adopt this new technology, then you're going to be left behind and either go extinct or find some sort of accommodation.
Yeah, but why did everybody else take it? That's my point. You have to clearly there's going to be a situation where you get a critical mass of people who use an item so that you're expected to use it.
Well,
Mobile
in
phones are a good example.
that case, the people who control the technology had power, and they wanted to have more of that power, so they wanted more of that technology.
But why did anybody use it? It's like as if they're just that everybody who's using technology is just basically a puppet for the technocrat who just pulls the strings. That doesn't seem plausible.
Well, it might not. Well, I think with mass media entertainment and
But this is where you're getting to belief formation. So I don't think I necessarily disagree with you as much as it might seem. But the locus of this has to be intertwined with motivation and as to why people. And this is why I think a lot of people fight against it, but a lot of people I think go, well, I'll go there. So, for instance, people don't think about it. Say, well, they'll go to university miles away from where they live. They have no real. They thought, well, this is what we do. Everyone else does it, and I get a decent job. It's fine. They don't really reflect to the fact that, well, actually, this is going to mean that I won't see my family as well, and then this is going to be more difficult for raising children down the line. The big change I think today is this. Historically, because of the lack of control over the external environment, people just ended up engaging in actions which were generally socially useful, because even if they acted in their own self-interest, it wouldn't break any of the main social bonds that existed. Today, everything needs to be is much more much more intentional, because you have the means of engaging in an action which actually seems like it's going to be good for you overall in the long run, but actually isn't, because of the amount of power you have over nature. And I think that's the major change. It has to be intentional, and that's why the boomers got stuff so wrong.
Okay,
because they
so
won't.
I think at this point, since we're almost done with the hour here, I think we'll stop it here, and this could possibly be a future episode for you and I to do, Swithun, about technology and choice. But so to wrap this up, I'll let you open. I'll let you, Keith Preston, have the first closing statement.
Yeah, one thing we haven't really touched on is the motivation of people within the ruling class or within systems of power. And there's different ways of looking at that. There are some people who say that people are largely just driven by circumstances of their conditions, meaning that, for example, I think a serious Marxist, somebody who really takes Marxism seriously, would have to agree with this, that the ruling class acts in a way that is consistent with the circumstances that they simply find themselves in as an accident of history, and they are merely, and that the ideas that members of the elite have are simply a reflection of their own interest as they perceive it based on their social circumstances. That's one way of looking at it, and that by extension that would apply to everybody. That would apply to everybody at every layer of society. People are just driven by the circumstances they find themselves in. There's another point of view that says that the ruling class is largely a collection of cynics. That is, people who don't really believe in anything. They just adopt whatever ideologies serves their own needs at a particular moment. Sam Francis leaned in this particular direction. And then there's another point of view that says that no, members of the elite generally believe in what they do as a matter of principle, and for whatever reason they either justify their own self-interest to themselves, or they're simply the product of their education and cultural environment. So these ideas overlap with each other in various ways as well. But I would tend to say that it's another case where you can't really look at it from a reductionist point of view. For instance, I would imagine that within the power elite, you have plenty of people who really believe they are acting in the best interest of humanity. On the other hand, you probably also have other people that could care less. They're just going by whatever serves their own particular needs at the moment. For instance, Henry Kissinger seems to be a figure that fits that particular description. And then there are probably others who simply find themselves in the position they're in because of circumstances. Some people, are probably in a position where, hey, I didn't ask to be born a Rockefeller. I'm just here, I think all of these things interact. And then because this question is important because it gets back to motivations. What motivates people who have power, who make decisions? Are they motivated by naked self-interest? Do they have ideals they're trying to pursue? Are they just victims of circumstances? Is it all of it? I'm inclined to say all of it because you have different individuals and different personality structures and that kind of thing as well, and different life experiences, even at the elite level. Another thing, though, about this question that I find interesting is the different political factions, the left and the right and all of that. They always accuse the other side of being in collusion with the ruling class. Like it doesn't matter what political faction you are, it's always your enemies that are in collusion with the ruling class, assuming you don't like the existing ruling class, which the majority of people don't. For instance, you will often find people on the far right accusing the far left of being in collusion with the intelligence services. You'll find people on the far left accusing the far right of being in collusion with the intelligence services. You'll hear the left say, well, the ruling class is using racism to divide and conquer the working class, and the right will say, well, no, actually they're using immigration to divide and conquer the ruling class. It could be they're using both, or that different sectors of the ruling class are using both for different purposes and working different ends against the middle. For example, you could identify ruling class interests that profit from, say, immigration, and you could find others that profit from immigration enforcement. These are not one-dimensional processes; these are multidimensional processes. And it gets back to the core point I've been trying to make in this whole discussion, which is that I don't think we can view a ruling class, a power elite, a state, or any of that stuff as a monolith. These are comprised of individuals and groups with personalities and objectives and interests of their own, sometimes in conflict with each other. And it's also the case that aristocrats and nobles and kings even, or popes, would sometimes align themselves with different groups of peasants against other aristocrats, whatever suited their needs at the particular moment, or whatever they thought was going to help them achieve whatever goals they wanted to achieve. So I think that's more or less the best description of how things actually work, how the distribution of power actually works.
All right, Swithun, closing thoughts on the ruling class.
Just on the motivation of the ruling class, to finish, generally speaking, you could say what motivates people is money, sex, or power. It seems to me that the ruling elites, whoever they are, have more than enough money, unless he wants to maintain it. That what I think motivates a lot of the ruling class is power. So I suppose I could take more of a Sam Francis position, although I do think there are idealists, but really the only two explanations for the true elite, I think, is to transform the world in their own image, because they just like the idea that it's in their image and it's good for them and they like to control people, or it's the fact that, well, they think it's good for them to do it. And obviously there's both of them. I do tend to think more on the cynical line. I mean, of anybody who is of a real major player in the ruling class, I do not think any of them believe that global warming will be catastrophic. I simply do not believe that they hold that, because it's a manifestly absurd position to take. And now, even if they did take that, nobody genuinely believes, I think, that somehow making all cars electric cars is going to help in any meaningful sense. Any support of that is either stupidity or cynicism. And since I don't think the ruling class are like to be stupid, because, well, they're ruling class and so they're adept in certain respects, I'm on the side of cynicism. And that would be my general comment on the motivations of the ruling class.
All right, we got one super chat, and I'll read that before we close out. Ori Samsonov for 32 shekels. I wish you guys would replace the ruling class. Well, if only, right, guys? If only. But thanks again, everybody. This is thanks again, Swithun, Keith Preston. This is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast signing off.